Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the place where we do not flinch from the shadows, but stare them straight in the eye, where we walk not only with the dreamers and builders, but with the tyrants and monsters too, because history does not only whisper lullabies, sometimes it growls warnings in the dark. Tonight we stand in the sweltering heart of Africa, in the blood-red dust of Uganda. Tonight, we meet a man whose name still chills old men who remember, whose grinning cruelty turned a nation's promise into a nightmare. His name, Idi Amin Dada, the self-styled conqueror of the British Empire, the last king of Scotland, a butcher in a general's hat, a clown who laughed as rivers ran red. Why did he rise? What broke in him, or perhaps what was always broken, that he became what he became? And what does his story still say about power, fear, and how thin the line is between a liberator and a tyrant? Sit close, my friends. Pour yourself something strong tonight and listen. Because to understand how men like Idi Amin come to rule, we must first look straight into their eyes. Before the medals and the monstrous titles, before the laughter that froze the blood of a nation, there was only a barefoot boy in the remote, sun-scorched scrublands of northwestern Uganda, a corner so far from the colonial capital that it might as well have been another world. Idi Amin Dada Umi, his birth shrouded in the mists of unrecorded time, is believed to have been born around 1925 in the town of Koboko near the Sudanese border. His people, the Kakwa, were a small Nilotic ethnic group, poor, marginalized, caught between stronger neighbors and the harsh edges of colonial rule. Little Idi's father was mostly absent, a drifter or laborer depending on the story, dead or simply gone by the time the boy could remember. His mother, Asa Ate, was a herbalist and healer, a woman who stitched her meager livelihood from roots, chants, and whispered knowledge passed down through generations. For Amin, childhood was a life of goats and dust, herding animals barefoot through thorn scrub, sleeping under the stars, fighting other boys with bare knuckles when a scrap of food or a goat's tether was at stake. He was big, even then, a giant among the children of Koboko. His fists settled disputes when words failed, which was often, for Idi never gained more than the simplest literacy. His world was not shaped by books, but by muscle, cunning, and the pecking order of boys who learned to fight young or go hungry, a life. Life in the colonial protectorate of Uganda was a sharp-edged thing. The British ruled from far away, from whitewashed offices in Kampala and Entebbe. They taxed the villages, they levied men for plantations and road gangs, they plucked the strongest to fill the ranks of the King's African Rifles, the British Army's colonial backbone in East Africa. For a poor, uneducated boy like Idi Amin, there were few doors open. The classroom was a luxury, the army, a lifeline. It promised food, a uniform, a salary, however meager. And above all, it promised power in a world where black men were still expected to bow before white overseers. So, sometime in the 1940s, the giant boy from Koboko, now a towering teenager with fists like sledgehammers and a taste for boxing, enlisted. He signed his name with clumsy letters, and he donned the khaki of the King's African Rifles. Amin found what he craved most: structure, status, fear in the eyes of lesser men. He could not quote Shakespeare or solve sums on a blackboard, but he could box like a demon, drill with cold precision, and do the dirty work few others stomached. The British officers took note. His brute strength made him useful. His loyalty seemed unshakable, at least when fed and flattered. He served in Burma during the Second World War, fighting Japan in jungle campaigns that taught him how to live off the land, how to obey, how to kill without hesitation. Back home, as the empire frayed and African nationalism stirred, Amin's ambition began to swell, larger than his uniform. He fought the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in the 1950s, a brutal conflict where lines blurred between counterinsurgency and butchery. He was promoted for his zeal and rumored cruelty. A seed takes root. By the dawn of the 1960s, Idi Amin was no longer a barefoot herdsman. He was a towering man in crisp khakis, gleaming boots, ribbons on his chest, a loyal colonial NCO who knew how to navigate the tangled politics of tribal rivalries and white overseers. The British, in their retreat, left behind men like Amin, big men in shiny hats, loyal to whoever kept their bellies full and their hands on a gun. Men who knew that in the new Africa, power would belong not to clerks with pens, but to soldiers with tanks. The giant from Koboko would not remain a footnote. He had tasted what it meant to be feared. He liked it. He would want more. So, my friends, this is where the story begins. A barefoot boy who learned that in a harsh land, might makes right, that fear can open doors no schoolhouse ever could. From dusty goat paths to barracks with foreign flags, Idi Amin Dada learned that if you are bigger than everyone else, you need only one lesson: crush what stands in your way. And so he did. When the sun set on the Union Jack in Uganda in 1962, the empire left behind more than railways and a national flag. It left behind an army full of men like Idi Amin. Soldiers who knew how to obey but were learning how to command. Men with guns. Men who knew that in a country split by tribes and fresh rivalries, whoever held the army held the throne. Uganda's first years of independence were fragile. Power swung between hope and mistrust. Ethnic tensions simmered. The northern groups, like Amin's Kakwa and their allies, had long been favored by the colonial army. The Southerners, the Baganda, and other large ethnic blocs feared this imbalance and resented the iron grip of the army. Into this fragile weave stepped two men: Milton Obote, a clever politician from the north, and Idi Amin, his blunt instrument. The soldier and the politician, Obote rose quickly after independence, positioning himself as the leader of a new, unified Uganda. But he knew that real power did not rest in parliament alone. It rested in the army barracks, the armored cars, the men with rifles. And so, when Obote needed a loyal hammer, he looked to Idi Amin. Amin had proven himself in the King's African Rifles, rising through the ranks like few Africans ever did under the British. He was charismatic in his own brutish way: big smiles, booming laughter, easy lies when needed. But beneath that charm was a ruthless ambition and a taste for violence that Obote found useful. Amin quickly became Obote's right hand for dirty work. When political rivals stirred in the countryside, it was Amin's soldiers who found them. When dissent threatened to split the fragile young nation, it was Amin's loyalty, or so Obote believed, that would hold the line. But while Obote built his new Uganda with speeches and policy, Amin built his own kingdom inside the army's barracks and mess halls. He rose to deputy commander, then commander of the armed forces. He recruited fiercely from his home region and tribes that would owe him everything. He flattered British officers who stayed on to advise, but quietly turned his loyalties inward, to himself, to his men, to the simple truth he had learned as a boy herding goats: protect your herd and crush the wolves. Obote was no fool. He knew Amin's ambitions could not stay hidden forever. Stories leaked of missing funds, smuggling deals, secret bank accounts, even gold and ivory trafficking from Congo, which Amin and some soldiers were rumored to have exploited for personal gain. Obote moved to sideline Amin, even ordering an investigation into his activities, but he underestimated the speed at which the hammer could swing back at the hand that held it. In January 1971, while Obote was away at a Commonwealth conference in Singapore, Amin struck. He had the loyalty of the army's northern regiments. He controlled the armored vehicles. He controlled the barracks. And when the time came, he controlled the radio stations. Tanks rolled through the streets of Kampala before dawn. Barricades rose at key roads and airfields. The people woke to the thud of boots and the rattle of machine guns. But there was no mass resistance. Many Ugandans, tired of Obote's own growing authoritarian streak and economic hardship, saw Amin as a hero, a strong man who might restore order. By the time Obote's plane landed back in Africa, the presidential palace was sealed off by troops loyal to his own trusted general. Obote fled into exile. Amin took the microphone at Radio Uganda, announcing in his booming voice that the army had seized power for the good of the people. He promised elections. He promised liberation from corruption and tribal favoritism. Ugandans cheered, at first. They did not yet know that they had traded a flawed civilian strongman for a grinning butcher in waiting. Idi Amin did not wait for titles to be handed out politely. Within weeks, he promoted himself from commander to field marshal. Within months, he dissolved parliament, suspended parts of the constitution, and declared himself president for life. His rallies overflowed with theatrics, dancing crowds, military parades, and bombastic declarations. He styled himself as a humble father figure, yet dressed like an emperor, festooned with medals, sashes, and grandiose titles like Conqueror of the British Empire and Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea. He played the West and the East against each other during the Cold War. He posed for photos with the Queen's portrait still on the wall, even as he mocked Britain by claiming parts of the British Empire as his rightful domain. To the crowds, he was the people's soldier. To his enemies, he was the serpent in the grass, and one by one they would learn that the giant from Koboko never forgot a threat, a slight, or a debt. So it was that the goat-herding boy, the brawler in a colonial uniform, rose to seize the throne with tanks and grins. His rise was no accident. It was the work of a man who learned early that in a country of divisions, fear is stronger than loyalty, and a gun is worth more than any flag. Amin sat in State House now, the giant of Koboko, the self-made king. The road to power had been built on smiles, betrayals, and blood. The worst, as Uganda would soon learn, was yet to come. Power, my friends, is a curious thing. It promises safety, but feeds on fear. It seduces with promises of order, and once the gates are closed, it sharpens its knives behind locked doors. When Idi Amin seized Uganda in 1971, he promised deliverance. He promised bread for the hungry, jobs for the jobless, and freedom for the oppressed. The people cheered as he danced in his new general's hat, smiling wide for foreign cameras. He freed political prisoners, opened churches and mosques, and even paid lip service to democracy. But beneath the smiles, the hunt had already begun. He knew what it took to topple a leader, because he'd just done it. So before anyone could do the same to him, he struck preemptively. Soldiers loyal to Milton Obote, especially from rival tribes like the Acholi and Langi, were rounded up. Many were told they were being transferred or retrained. They boarded trucks singing patriotic songs. Some were never seen again. Bodies began to appear in the Nile, bloated shapes caught in fishermen's nets, stripped of boots and identity, throats slit. Some say the crocodiles feasted so well in those years that they grew to monstrous size. Amin then turned on the police, the civil service, judges, anyone who might question him. Files vanished, courthouses emptied. Those who resisted disappeared into safe houses, which were anything but safe. In the basement cells of the State Research Bureau, Amin's dreaded secret police, men and women were tortured with electric wires, clubs, and worse. Outside the capital, governors and mayors became puppets. Tribal rivalries were stoked deliberately. The old British tactic of divide and rule turned inward by a local master. Amin recruited loyalists from the West Nile region, his Kakwa people, Nubians, and mercenaries from Sudan. These men, often poorly educated but fiercely loyal to Amin, became his hammer and shield. The purge widened. Intellectuals, professors, journalists, newspapers that once reported freely were shuttered overnight. University lecturers vanished after giving lectures that displeased the big man. Political opponents fled into exile, if they could. Many were tracked down anyway. By the mid-1970s, the joke in Kampala was grim. If you heard footsteps at night, pray they were thieves, not soldiers. In 1972, Amin made the decision that would cripple Uganda's economy for a generation and cement his image abroad as a reckless tyrant. Uganda's small but influential Asian community, mostly Indians and Pakistanis, had lived there for generations. Many owned businesses, shops, banks, and factories. They ran trade routes, stocked shelves, and kept towns humming with commerce. But to Amin, they were an easy scapegoat. Foreigners, convenient targets for his brand of African nationalism. He accused them of economic sabotage, of hoarding wealth, of failing to integrate. In truth, many Ugandans envied their prosperity, an envy Amin stoked like dry brush set alight. He announced, live on radio, that all Asians without Ugandan citizenship had 90 days to leave the country. They were allowed to take only what they could carry. Shops were abandoned overnight, schools closed. Entire neighborhoods emptied as families scrambled for flights and ships out. Amin handed their businesses to his cronies and loyal soldiers, men who had no idea how to run factories, banks, or trading posts. Uganda's fragile economy, once envied for its promise, began to collapse. Shelves emptied, corruption spread like plague. But Amin didn't care. He had given his people enemies to blame and gifts to loot. The buffoon and the butcher. To the outside world, Idi Amin was a grotesque caricature, a giant in a field marshal's hat, dripping in medals, grinning as he posed with foreign dignitaries. He gave himself absurd titles: His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. Behind the buffoonery was horror. Dissidents fled, if they were lucky. Many were tortured, their bodies dumped along roadsides. Entire villages lived in fear that the next sweep of the army would leave them fatherless. Rumors swirled of cannibalism, of Amin keeping severed heads in his fridge, of feeding his enemies to crocodiles. Some of these tales blurred fact and nightmare, but enough was true that no rumor seemed impossible. Former wives vanished. Friends who crossed him wound up dead. Amin himself boasted of his strength, once declaring he had eaten the flesh of his enemies to absorb their power. Foreign leaders tried to laugh him off, but they could not ignore the rivers of blood. Some, like Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, supported him with weapons. The Soviet Union flirted with him for a time. The West, embarrassed by his antics, tiptoed away. But Amin didn't care. He threw lavish parties in Kampala's grand hotels, feasting on fine food and whiskey while his people starved. The people pay the price. By the late 1970s, Uganda was an open wound. Roads crumbled, hospitals emptied, markets dried up, families whispered of loved ones who never returned from work, communities learned not to ask too many questions. But the big man's paranoia only grew. He shuffled his cabinet endlessly, trusting no one for long. He insulted foreign leaders, threatened to invade neighbors, and made outlandish claims about his greatness. When journalists asked how he slept at night, Amin grinned, "I sleep very well, because I know I have killed all my enemies." This, my friends, was the reign of Idi Amin, a carnival of horror dressed up in military ribbons and grotesque jokes. The world laughed at the madman in the general's hat, but in the shadows of Uganda, no one laughed at all. In the end, even a monster can overreach. And as the people suffered and the coffers ran dry, Idi Amin would find that terror is a fire that burns the one who lights it. The giant from Koboko was about to learn that even kings of fear can be toppled. Every tyrant believes his power will last forever. Every butcher thinks the knife he holds cannot turn back toward him. But history is a hungry wheel. It turns, and when it turns on monsters, it rarely shows mercy. For years, Idi Amin ruled Uganda with fear and farce in equal measure, a buffoon to the world, a butcher to his people. But as the 1970s drew to a close, the pillars that propped up the giant from Koboko began to crack under the weight of his own delusions. The paranoia at 77, the signs were everywhere. The economy had rotted from within. Shops were empty, food scarce, black markets ruled the streets of Kampala. The generals and colonels Amin trusted were themselves watching their backs, fearing they'd be next to disappear into the cold cells of the State Research Bureau. Amin's erratic behavior worsened. He shuffled his ministers like a deck of marked cards. He purged loyal officers on a whim, only to reinstate them days later. Rumors of coup plots filled the air, some real, some invented by Amin himself to justify more bloodletting. Foreign allies drifted away. The British had long abandoned him. Israel, which had once quietly supplied him, was now a bitter enemy after Amin flipped allegiance to Libya and the Palestinian cause. The Soviets, who once sent arms, found his antics too costly and unreliable. He had become an embarrassment, a man who proclaimed himself the last king of Scotland, who penned bizarre letters to Queen Elizabeth asking for ships and jets, who staged ridiculous press conferences in grand hotels while villagers starved in the countryside. One moment more than any other exposed Amin's limits to the world and to Ugandans holding their breath for deliverance. In 1976, Palestinian hijackers diverted an Air France flight to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. Amin, ever hungry for the spotlight, offered himself as mediator, publicly praising the hijackers, mocking the West, and pretending to play the peacemaker while the hostages were held under guard by his own soldiers. Then came the thunderclap, Operation Entebbe. Israeli commandos, flying under radar cover, landed under darkness, stormed the terminal, freed the hostages, and fled, leaving dozens of dead hijackers and Ugandan soldiers in their wake. Amin was humiliated. The world saw that his regime, so puffed up with uniforms and bravado, could be pierced in a single daring night. His fury turned inward, and the purges deepened. In his final gamble for glory, Amin turned to the oldest trick in the tyrant's book, an enemy at the gates. He needed a distraction, something to rally his loyalists, to distract from the failing economy and growing whispers of rebellion. In 1978, his troops crossed the border into Tanzania, claiming disputed territory and hunting Ugandan exiles who plotted against him. He declared a quick, glorious victory. He promised to annex part of Tanzania to expand his domain. But the giant had misjudged. Tanzania, led by the resolute Julius Nyerere, struck back with quiet fury. Tanzanian forces, joined by Ugandan exiles thirsting for revenge, swept north in a disciplined counterattack. Amin's army, hollowed out by years of purges, corruption, and incompetence, melted away before them. Officers defected. Soldiers fled or switched sides. The fear that once glued Amin's power together turned to panic and desertion. By April 1979, Tanzanian tanks rolled through Kampala's broad avenues. The dictator's statues were pulled down by gleeful crowds. The once fearsome State Research Bureau was overrun, its secrets laid bare, its dungeons emptied, its walls soaked with blood and horror. Amin, ever the survivor, did not stand and fight. He slipped out through Entebbe Airport. The very same airport he once boasted was his symbol of power. He fled to Libya first, seeking the shelter of Gaddafi. But even Gaddafi tired of him and pushed him further along to Saudi Arabia. There, in the port city of Jeddah, the conqueror of the British Empire faded into a gilded ghost. The Saudis, for their own reasons, gave him a comfortable exile, a villa by the Red Sea, a security detail, enough money to live in quiet obscurity, but no stage on which to roar again. He lived there for decades, a family man once more, surrounded by wives and children, telling visitors fantastical tales about his greatness. He claimed he still deserved to rule Uganda. He insisted he'd return, welcomed by his people. But Uganda did not welcome him back. They were too busy burying the dead he left behind. Too busy trying to rebuild a nation where an entire generation had vanished into rivers, jungles, and unmarked graves. In 2003, Idi Amin Dada, the giant from Koboko, the butcher, the buffoon, the king in exile, died in a Saudi hospital of multiple organ failure. He was never tried. He never repented. He never saw the prison cell so many of his victims had known. So ended the reign of Idi Amin, not with a final battle in a palace drenched in fire, but in the quiet hush of an air-conditioned room, far from the rivers that carried his victims away. He escaped the hangman's rope, the firing squad, the tribunal of history. But his ghost remains, in the children whose parents never came home, in the broken villages still haunted by secrets, in the hush that falls when his name is spoken. So, my friends, why speak his name? Why stare into the eyes of a butcher long buried in foreign soil? Why retell the tale of Idi Amin Dada when so many would rather turn the page? Because tyrants do not appear from nowhere. Monsters do not rise in a vacuum. The face of Idi Amin is not only the face of Uganda's tragedy, it is a mirror showing how fear, power, and neglect can breed horrors anywhere, given the right poison. Uganda's young independence lacked robust checks on its army, its courts, its civil service. The colonial powers built a system of force, then left its weapons behind, but not the safeguards. Amin was the product of that void, a man who stepped into power on the back of a rifle, who turned state terror into personal rule because there was nothing strong enough to stop him once he tasted what absolute fear could buy. Today, across the world, in corners large and small, we still see leaders who chip away at courts, muzzle the press, whisper to the army that they alone are loyal. Each of them thinks they can control the tiger. Idi Amin shows us what happens when the tiger learns it likes the taste of blood. Amin matters because he teaches us about the price of silence. The world laughed at Amin, at his absurd titles, his clownish interviews, his bombastic threats to Britain and Israel, and his ridiculous boasts of empire. They laughed, but they looked away. For years, while rivers of bodies flowed through the Nile, foreign governments traded with him, shook his hand at conferences, posed for photos. They condemned him only when it was too late, when he embarrassed them publicly or threatened their interests directly. It's easy to watch a distant tragedy and assume it cannot spill over, but dictators do not respect borders. Amin's final mistake, his invasion of Tanzania, proved that monsters left unchecked grow teeth that snap far beyond the walls they build for themselves. Amin matters because memory matters. In Uganda today, many of his victims lie in unmarked graves. Many families never saw their loved ones again. Stories were whispered in the dark for decades because people feared the shadows would come back if they spoke too loudly. Yet each generation must tell the story so that it does not repeat. And not just in Uganda, Rwanda, Cambodia, Syria. The list stretches on. The same ghosts wear new uniforms, speak new slogans, and promise new salvations, but the bones beneath the slogans are the same. Idi Amin's name is a warning. Watch the strongman who laughs too loudly. Watch the uniforms that answer only to him. Watch the promises of easy enemies and quick victories. The tyrant's crown is not made of gold, it is stitched from the silence of those who looked away. Idi Amin is gone, buried far from the country he once strangled in his iron grip. But the lesson of the giant from Koboko walks with us every day. If we do not listen to the cries of those who vanish in the night, if we do not guard the freedoms that seem so ordinary, if we let fear and power breed behind closed doors, then someday, somewhere, another tyrant will smile that same grin, and the rivers will run red again. That is why we speak his name. Not to honor it, but to remember, because memory, my friends, is history's only true guard dog. And so, my friends, our fire burns low tonight, but its glow still clings to our faces. We have walked through a shadowed chapter of history, one lined with medals and machetes, with laughter that curdled into screams. We have stood eye to eye with the giant from Koboko, a man whose reign reminds us that cruelty does not always wear horns and fangs. Sometimes it grins, salutes, and promises peace. Idi Amin did not fall from the sky. He rose from poverty, from colonial neglect, from tribal wounds never healed. He rose because power unchecked is a door flung open for any man willing to do what others will not. And when that door opened, the world, distracted, amused, dismissive, looked the other way until it could not anymore. Tonight, we remember not just Amin, but the voices he tried to erase. The students who whispered dissent in Kampala's dusty lecture halls, the soldiers who fled into the night rather than spill their neighbors' blood, the shopkeepers and teachers and mothers who wept in silence for the missing. We speak their names by refusing to forget his. We hold up the candle so that when the shadows gather again, and they always do, we are ready to guard the flame. Faces of History does not shy away from the monsters. To understand the dreamers, the Athelstans, the Disneys, the Eiffels, we must also understand the Amins. For every bridge that lifts us up, there is a blade that cuts us down if we do not guard the pillars of freedom and truth. So next time you hear someone praise the strongman who promises quick answers, next time you hear cheers for leaders who shout loudest while silencing all others, remember the blood that once stained the Nile. Remember the giant who laughed while a nation wept. Remember the stories old men still whisper in Uganda when they warn their grandchildren, never again. Here at Faces of History, we tell the whole story, bright and brutal, noble and cruel, hopeful and grim. Because history, my friends, is not just kings and queens, towers and treaties. It is the unblinking memory of what we must not repeat. Thank you for standing in this darkness with me tonight, for listening, for daring to look. Next time we will rise into the light again, because history has many faces, and some still smile with hope. Until then, guard your freedom, question power, protect the truth, and pour yourself something warm when the shadows gather. This has been Faces of History. I am your host, the Duke of New York. Good night, my friends, and remember, history is always watching.